Hello, everybody, and thank you very much for joining this panel. A very warm welcome to the distinguished panelists. I want to say that actually talking about disinformation is always like very urgent, very pressing issue, but I have to say that I'm very glad that all the participants of this conference got a very live demonstration of the Hungarian disinformation space as well. Just yesterday, how it is to be a target of disinformation when one of the members, Hungarian members of the European Parliament, came out yesterday in front of the building to hold a press conference about us participants being here, supported by the dollar left, the dollar media, to hold a hate workshop. So, as I'm a fact checker, I have to say that we are not going to do the hate workshop this time, but we are trying to talk about like very concrete examples of what is going on right now in the disinformation space, and most importantly, what can we all do against the spread of disinformation? And I would suggest to actually start with a round of introduction, as all the participants are coming from different areas of research. They approach the matter of disinformation from different angles. I would like to ask you all to present, what do you think, in your views, what are the most current trends of disinformation, the most astonishing patterns that you have seen in your research?
Thank you for the question, and thank you for having me. Thank you to Budapest Forum for flying me over. It's been a great experience. First time in Budapest, and it's absolutely wonderful. So thank you for welcoming me, Peter. I study conspiracy theories specifically, and not just disinformation. But I could give you a few trends that I think are sort of, I might not say are astonishing, but are fairly important. One is that this is often a top-down problem, is that we have a lot of political leaders and let's say mainstream media who push ideas that aren't necessarily true, and it happens quite a bit. There seems to be a narrative out there that, oh, if you go to social media, you'll find people spreading conspiracy theories, where it seems to be a bottom-up phenomena. But we had a president who was doing it every day. And now I have a governor in my state who does it quite often too. So it's not really a social media problem in that sense, right? So I always find it ironic when we say, well, we got to have the government get rid of these conspiracy theories. I say, well, the government's the one spreading them, so that's sort of strange. And when I get calls from government saying, hey, what can we do about it? I'm like, talk to your boss. Why are you calling me? So the second part of that is a lot of this is in the mainstream media, and you know, so with all due deference to the New York Times journalist who's here, I don't want to pick on him, but in the Times over the last year, I think there were some articles calling into question evolution. There was recently an article that was taking a very kind look at the guy who claims to bend spoons with his mind. And a lot of alien articles, you know, with very fantastic headlines, like, finally they have a UFO and an alien body. I'm like, no, they don't. But there it is in top newspapers. And I think the third trend I'll get to is, it's not necessarily the horseshoe theory of politics where the poles sort of meet each other. But maybe one way to think about politics is that there's two dimensions to it. It's not so much far left and far right, sort of being extreme versions of moderates. It's more that you have people who might be somewhere along the left and right, and then have traits that put them up on this higher dimension. And maybe the best term for that isn't necessarily far or extreme, because their ideologies might not be fully formed in a way we normally think about it on a liberal conservative plane, but maybe more they have personality traits that make them cantankerous when they are activated into mainstream politics, or they like to engage in politics in very non-normative ways. Maybe they're conflictual. Maybe they are, maybe they have a lot of dark personality traits and like to lie a lot online. But these people are out there. And far from being a story about an innocent person who slipped on a banana peel and wound up on a 8chan Holocaust denial site, this is a story about, you know, you have a certain portion of the population that are seeking out those sites because that's the kind of people they are. And it's not good people buying bad beliefs, it's bad people buying bad beliefs because they're bad people. And at some point, we have to look in the mirror and say, this is just a part of humanity. And it's something we have to come to grips with, and we can't just blame Mark Zuckerberg or Twitter or whatever and say it's some far-out thing doing it to us, because that's just a conspiratorial way of thinking about this. At some point, we have to realize that we are the monster in the room.
Hi, everybody, and thank you so much to the Budapest Forum for having me here today. I work at the U.S. Helsinki Commission, where I advise senators and members of Congress on a number of regional issues. But the war in Ukraine has by far been our main focus over the last year and a half. And while I'll leave discussion on some more technical elements of disinformation to my colleagues, one of the most remarkable consequences I've seen on disinformation in my area of focus is Russia's ability to sow confusion in the West about Ukraine. And the reason I find this so troubling is that the war in Ukraine is basically as straightforward and as morally clear as it gets. We have an aggressor committing war crimes on one side, Russia, and we have Ukraine literally fighting for its right to exist on the side of democracy and human rights. Now, don't get me wrong, support for Ukraine is very strong in the US, and the political and material support for Ukraine will continue. But there's enough chaos in the information sphere that it creates real confusion. And I can see this, you know, talking to friends or contacts outside of my immediate bubble. The confusion is very real. And what's behind this is a very deliberately orchestrated campaign that I'm sure so many of you in the room are aware of, not even to promote one particular narrative, but to insert a lot of noise. And we can see a direct line of Russian propaganda narratives straight to some US voices. You know, obviously there's characters like Tucker Carlson who have had a tendency to repeat some Kremlin propaganda points, like the false claim that there are 7 Ukrainian casualties for every 1 Russian, which is completely false. But it goes way past Tucker Carlson. I mean, disinformation monitors have found over 350 different news sites promoting over 100 different narratives, and that's a lot of noise. And even credible Western media have fallen for Russian propaganda. There's been a narrative repeated, you know, on CNN, Washington Post, Financial Times, that Western corporations have failed to leave Russia. And looking more closely at those articles, it's clear that the evidence cited actually comes straight from Russian reports. The truth is that over 1,000 multinational corporations have left Russia, which is 6 times the historic 200 companies that left South Africa during apartheid. So this isn't new. It's been the Kremlin's goal for years to sow confusion and undermine a shared reality in the West, but it's particularly troubling to witness doubt or uncertainty in parts of the American electorate about Russia's war in Ukraine, where it's pretty much as morally black and white as it gets.
Well, thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm Beth Goldberg. As Blanka mentioned, I'm the head of research and development at a place called Jigsaw. We're a unit inside Google that's like a think and do tank. And I will take a minute just to explain what that is and before I jump in. But I should also say thank you to Péter for inviting me here. Thank you to the Budapest Forum. I've gotten to read your work and swap notes with you and Joe for years, but I have never done it in person, so this is a real treat. So Jigsaw is I mentioned, a think and do tank. I have the privilege of leading a team of both social scientists and data scientists and network scientists on a variety of types of research. Everything we do is free and open source. But the two types of research that are most relevant to disinformation, one is what we call information interventions, and I'll talk a little bit about that later on this panel, sort of more proactive solutions to make ourselves more resilient to disinformation online. The other type of research we do is ethnographic, so drawing from anthropology and sociology, where we go and we sit down with people who are the perpetrators of abuses online or the targets of those abuses. So we'll go sit in the living rooms of these conspiracy theorists and we'll ask them, tell me how you grew up. Tell me your life story. And then by the end, they're walking us through their Telegram channels and how they, create and spread conspiracy theories. And it's a really sort of deep, rich style of research. And from that research, there are two main trends that I'll draw out. This is from some recent research we've done in Brazil, the US, and India. So zooming out from the US context, which you've already heard a lot about, I'm seeing a fragmentation of the ecosystem. Now, this will not be news to any of you who have watched the sort of implosion of X in the last year or so, and the sort of fragmentation of many knockoffs of Twitter. But there's also been a fragmentation of things like private chat apps, people migrating to spaces like Telegram, and then within Telegram, even a fragmentation into more and more closed groups. And what this fragmentation away from a handful of really dominant mainstream social media platforms into smaller closed spaces is doing is a few things. A, it's making it much harder for us as researchers or for intelligence agencies to sort of track these disinformation narratives. It's also making it much harder to reach people with authoritative information. And it's allowing the rise of the second trend that I want to flag, which is the rise of these micro-influencers. Now, when everyone was on just YouTube or just Facebook, you could have these mega influencers that had tens of millions of followers, right? And those folks still exist. We had the stories like the Disinformation Dozen, who were spreading most of the information about COVID-19. But those folks still exist, but as people are fragmenting away from the mainstream platforms, you're getting these micro-influencers who have maybe 1 to 100,000 followers. And they're starting to build up their own followership, and they're spinning their own conspiracy theories. So you're seeing the rise of these sort of small players who are getting really clever at evading platform policies. They're doing things like spinning small, misleading, really non-falsifiable posts. They're asking provocative questions. They're using satire or opinion. They're often using a lot of pseudoscientific jargon, but they're really being quite clever about the ways in which they're evading platforms' moderations. And platforms simply can't keep up with the proliferation of these smaller influencers the way that they could much more easily go after the handful of mega influencers in prior years.
Thank you. My name is Balázs Vedres. I'm a network scientist and a data scientist here at CEU. I mean, here meaning in Vienna, but also here at the DI, unfortunately. Austro-Hungarian, yes. So I'm coming at this from data science. And us data scientists always on the kind of predisposition to see if a phenomenon exists before we try to explain it or before we try to see the outcomes of it. And I came to the phenomenon of social bots and automation on civic publics. Many of my colleagues analyze millions of tweets or millions of Telegram or Reddit exchanges. And often as a sideline, when they describe the data, they mention, oh, by the way, we deleted communication from bots. And this started to be curious to me. So just how much are we deleting? Elon Musk bought Twitter X. there was a lot of talk about bots and bot accounts, and we don't know how many. And so I started to go after this. How many? And just what's the extent? What's the size of this phenomena of automation on civic publics? And it's astonishing. In terms of accounts, it's anything between 20 to 50% of accounts now. And in terms of communication, the number of speech acts, tweets, it's between 50% and 70%. And it's a trend. So pretty soon we will have just bots talking to each other on civic publics and nothing else. So this is astonishing. What does this mean to civic exchanges? What does this mean to anything, any discussion about the public good? That we have these agents that often pass as humans against the platform's rules, manifestly breaking those. The platforms are just half-heartedly going after them because they're interested in traffic and not decreasing the number of accounts. The biggest drop in share prices ever was Meta when they first saw, oops, we might be decreasing in the number of user accounts. So there is a zoo out there with all these bots. So what's the consequence? What do they do? What kind of impact do they have? We are not looking at the content of what they say. We just look at, well, if you meet a bot, if you engage with a bot, what happens to you as an activist? Do you become more active, less active? Do you become agitated? Do you talk in a more rational tone or a more emotionally charged tone? And what we started to see as a first consequence is that there is an impact, and it's not so clear who is a bot and who is not. So when we started this project, we thought, okay, so we'll detect the bots. And when I said, 50% of the accounts are bots, in truth, we have a sense of algorithmicness of the behavior rather than capturing humans on one side and bots on the other side. It's a continuum. The algorithmicness of how we engage in social media. Often us humans engage in a way that's very algorithmic and robotic, as it seems. So it's really hard to say what algorithmic is. Then the next consequence that we saw is that it's exactly those algorithmic agents, maybe I use that word instead of bots, because that's covering the reality a bit more. So it's those agents that are not as clear-cut. It's not so easy to say, it's a spam bot, it's an astroturfing bot, it's something really clear. Those are the accounts, those are the agents that have the biggest impact. And this is scary, because with the onslaught of generative AI feeding into social bots and their kind of algorithms, this will have a massive impact, and we will have less and less capacity to detect it, to capture it, and to sort out who's a bot and who is not. We are using 5 different algorithms to predict who is algorithmic and who is not, and those algorithms diverge. We cannot really have a consensus of which accounts are algorithmic. But what we see is that they do result in more emotionally charged negative sentiment communication. They result in a decrease in engagement if the bot is really a clear-cut bot, and they result in an increase in engagement if the bot is something not so clear-cut. So we might see a social media world where we won't be able to recognize who's a bot, and those will be able to drive discussions, they will drive engagement up, they will drive sentiment to the negative or to the more extreme, and we will have no way of knowing who's the bot, what's the agenda behind them, and who is a real activist. So we really need some solution to this. And as I said, I'm a data scientist trying to capture the phenomena, and you might be much more equipped to come up with solutions. Péter.
Thank you. And the reason why I'm really happy that we have good Hungarian and American experts here around the table is that I often have the experience in conferences increasingly that the most crazy conspiracy theories and the most widespread conspiracy theories can be found in the United States and Hungary. So it's quite striking, I think, that 2 countries with totally different history, totally different political systems, and totally different traditions can show some similarities when it comes to this, I think, tribal, polarized environment that is a fertile ground of conspiracy theorizing and disinformation. And we at Political Capital is dealing with research in partially supported by the European Commission, together with Lakmusz and Mérték and others, and partially with the support of the National Endowment for Democracy. We try to identify conspiracy narratives, measure them in the public opinion, and also the conspiracy and disinformation infrastructures that are emerging. And what we have just found in a recent research, I think what is Hungarian disinformation space is rather unique. When Michael Shermer said that you cannot just spread disinformation through social media, and you can pretty much see it in Hungary as well, when the interesting narratives that, for example, Blanka have quoted on the hate workshop that you are all participating at the moment. So this is coming from prime time, from the state television, from mainstream news sources, and so on and so on. On the other hand, I think, so it's a bit of, but we know it. In the 20th century, there were a lot of examples historically how states can dominate the media. So, and I'm really happy that that almost all of you touched upon the state-sponsored disinformation, because I think this is something way more important than the bottom-up, spontaneous, and also much more resources invested in that and much more efficient. But what is, I think, much more interesting in the Hungarian disinformation space is how the state and actors close to the state can dominate the social media as well and create an almost Orwellian environment through paid advertisements with pro-governmental celebrities, the megaphone, for example, that, I mean, celebrities and opinion leaders who jump into your face with 100% in an election campaign if you switch on Facebook, because many tens of thousands of dollars are put in one single video, and Facebook posts in a country of 10 million. So so you can dominate the social media similarly than the traditional media. And what we have just found, and if you are interested in Political Capital's website, this is the first hit right now, the analysis that have just came out. So we found that also there are pseudo grassroots movements emerging, for example, in local Facebook groups. So there are these city local Facebook groups, for example, that are dealing with issues like let's plant trees, let's collect waste, and so on and so on, and genuine citizens who care about their environment and about their city, village, and so on come together there. And you can just see that pro-governmental influencers with Facebook profiles, or it's like, I would rather say classical trolls, with Facebook profiles, usually from VKontakte or other Russian social media channels, are appearing there. All of the profiles are created a few months ago. There are several hundreds of profiles that are popping up in these groups, and they all do the same, diverting the message from local to national. And the national is that, or Budapest-like, it's like the leadership of Budapest is highly incompetent, and they are posting pro-governmental media articles, and they are very efficient in diverting the conversation, and it's most probably a low-cost project, but with quite high efficiency, and we expect that this will be a new model, disinformation model infrastructure that is being tested right now in Hungary. It reacts to our analysis as well, so we feel great as researchers that, you know, when your research subject is reacting to the topic, so they have named themselves after my colleagues revealed their identity, for example, but it's a new information trend, and that really creates this post-truth sentiment among citizens that I think we should discuss, that even the seemingly grassroots, bottom-up movements are usually highly dominated by political actors who are not lacking resources.
Okay, so the microphone is traveling back. I think I will ask more complex questions now, so we don't have to fight for the microphone, but everybody can choose the aspect that they would like to reflect on. But we had lots of different aspects of actors of disinformation, from state-sponsored actors through micro-influencers to us, the monsters. But this is all still largely is spread online on big platforms. I'm wondering, first, how do you see the responsibility of big platforms in spreading disinformation? Second, have you seen any good practices in your field of research, in your own experiment? And I'm especially wondering about practices that could be exported to other countries, what can we learn from each other in this regard? And from the researcher side, actually, I would be really interested as well about how much data is available from the platforms to actually come to these findings. Maybe Beth, you said that you're going to elaborate on your good practices.
Thanks. I'll make a quick remark first on the responsibility of tech. I think that's fair. Someone here from Google. It'd be awkward if I didn't. And then I'll leave you all with something that I think is quite promising and is definitely something that can be expanded to different regions, including Hungary. So what is tech responsible for with respect to disinformation? From my perspective, and I think from Google's, there is a responsibility to remove harmful disinformation. This is part of published policies and practices. There's also a responsibility to reduce the misleading information, reduce its visibility, and simultaneously to elevate the visibility of more authoritative information. Now, this is especially important in moments like right now, where we have conflicts, so something like what's happening in Israel. I think it's absolutely critical that Google is doing things like they are, which is raising up those authoritative sources to the top of results on places like YouTube and Google search. There's also a responsibility that my team takes very seriously to help educate people about how to navigate information online. So this is media literacy efforts. It's adding context around posts. So if any of you saw information during the height of sort of the COVID-19 crisis, there were lots of panels underneath videos and on the side of information online that said, here's the link to the World Health Organization for more context on this topic. But there are also responsibilities of platforms to do even more proactive interventions. And this is where I've been swapping notes with people like Péter to try to understand how we can take lessons from psychologists, from lots of academics, and translate those ideas into the social media age. So I'll tell you about one of them that I've spent the last 4.5 years of my life pouring myself into. This is my baby. It's actually not mine at all. It's from the 1960s, well before I was born, but it's called pre-bunking. If you're not familiar with pre-bunking, you're probably familiar with debunking or fact-checking, which is where after someone is exposed to disinformation, you explain the specific claims. Pre-bunking is where you go beforehand and you sort of proactively warn someone about the type of disinformation. It's not the specifics, but it's saying, you might see this narrative that vaccines are dangerous, or you might see this narrative that refugees are dangerous. Here's what it would look like, a little example of it, and here are the counter arguments. You equip someone with sort of the antibodies, if you will, if you're going to use that vaccine metaphor. You equip someone to defend themselves against the disinformation well before they encounter it. And so for many years, this was done in academic settings or maybe in public health settings with lectures, with sort of long-form classroom settings. And we said, wow, how could we make this work in the age of short attention spans and social media? And so we've been developing short videos. These are all the way down to 30 seconds now, where we do this sort of pre-bunking message. And we say, hey, you're living in Central Europe right now. This was a year ago. You might see misinformation about Ukrainian refugees. It might say that the refugees are causing shortages in housing. this is why that's wrong. Here's an example of what it might look like. And here are reasons why people are just fleeing the war. And actually there is enough housing stock, et cetera, et cetera. And so we made these short videos, and we've been able to distribute them as ads, which is really, really useful to scale quite quickly. So in the span of just 2 months last year, we were able to show these pre-bunking videos to over 90 million people in Central Europe. Now you're all wondering, does this actually work? How do you know if it actually works? We're able to do sort of a test both first in an academic lab setting and publish those results, and then follow that up on social media with a quick one-question quiz, where we asked people if they could correctly identify, say, scapegoating. And we found that for most cases, it actually did work. In some places, it didn't. And the lesson for us there is we were too late. We weren't actually pre-bunking anymore. The disinformation had beaten us. But I think pre-bunking is the optimistic sort of mitigation strategy. I'm not going to call it solution, but it's definitely a mitigation strategy that I want to leave you all with. And it's something that my team and my colleagues at Google, alongside civil society partners and fact checkers, are now scaling up around the world. We actually just launched a campaign in Indonesia 2 days ago. So I think this has real opportunity to get out ahead of disinformation wherever it is. Who wants to jump in?
I think the most interesting initiative that we're doing now is that we're actually paying attention to it. Just a very quick personal story. I didn't decide to get into the conspiracy theory topic on my own. A colleague knocked on my door in 2010 and said, "Hey, do you want to do this thing?" And I said, "No." I said, "That's stupid. No one cares about it, and you're going to ruin our careers." And I was wrong, but I was only proved wrong 6 years after the fact, when Trump became a big thing in the US. And we could not have predicted that at that time. I'd like to say that we predicted it, but we didn't predict it. But we're paying attention. And I guess, to me, the story sort of winds up being a good news, bad news. The good news is that, in a lot of ways, things aren't getting worse. In the US and even other countries where we've been taking repeated measurements, people aren't believing conspiracy theories more over time. The bad news is things have always been this bad, we just didn't know it and weren't paying attention. And especially people like us, right? You have the educated classes who are in government, in journalism, in the professorate, in big tech, and we're not hanging out with the folks who are commonly trafficking in narratives about satanic baby eaters. That's not something we're very familiar with. So we don't pay attention. And then when we run a poll and say, oh, we've got 30% who say that's probably true, and we're like, oh boy, who are these people? And that's a normal question for us to ask because we don't know who those people are, most of us. But they're there, and they're out there. They're just not in our social circles. So a lot of the data that we get back is just shocking. And I guess that's the big thing. And I think one other thing I would say is that spread is a problem. But one thing you should see that's neat on this panel is you've got somebody who looks at the anthropology of it, one person who looks at people's beliefs through polling, and another person who's studying this across networks. And Peter, I know, does polling very much like I do too. But those are all sort of in their own silos, often, in how we approach the problem. So we often each wind up with our own solution, right? So you can see a lot of spread online, but that doesn't necessarily translate into people believing these ideas more when people like Peter and I poll on them more, right? So it's sort of a weird thing, because I don't see it as spread. I see it as we've got a lot of people who are already believing these things in a whole lot of ways, or at least very much inclined to, and then all it takes is a little hint and they're already there. And some of them don't even need the hint. So a typical conversation I have with a journalist is, hey Joe, there's a new conspiracy theory going around on Twitter. And I say, so what? And they say, well, it's going to spread everywhere, and everyone who sees it's going to believe it. And I say, so did you see it? And they say, yeah. And I say, so you must believe it. And they say, no. And I say, well, what makes you so special? What superhuman talent do you have that the rest of us dupes don't have, right? And what they come to realize is, no, people just don't believe everything that they see. There are certain people who are seeking out what they already believe, and at most, it's emboldening beliefs they already have, that they've acquired a long time ago through processes that started long before social media probably even showed up. And oftentimes when people blame social media, I'm like, well, what about cable TV? Right? I mean, I have 200 channels. If I flip through at any given time, there's going to be 20 channels that are just doing haunted houses, ghosts, Bigfoot. The biggest shows on Animal Planet, which I thought was a channel about real animals, are Finding Bigfoot. They still haven't found him. And the Navy conspiracy to kill the mermaids. And that's the biggest show ever on Animal Planet. There's no mermaids and the Navy wasn't killing them. Or maybe there's no mermaids because the Navy already killed them all. I don't know. But it's everywhere and we're knee deep in it. So to act like it's the fault of Google or Facebook is to just sort of completely forget the past and view it through rosy glasses. So when people say, why are things so bad now? I say, well, are they worse than when we were killing witches? Is it worse than that? Or worse than during the Red Scare? I say, yes, we have tons of problems, but we can't say that things are necessarily worse in every way. And the things that should really bother us are when people who have serious political power, when they have an authoritative use of force that they can use to act on their conspiracy theories. And by that, I mean our politicians.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to talk a little bit about some promising initiatives I've seen to defend the public against disinformation. One I really want to mention that's a little bit fun is one of the best civil society initiatives I've seen to defend against Russian disinformation is NAFO. Anyone know about NAFO? If you haven't already seen or heard of them, it's a play on NATO, but it's the North Atlantic Fellows Organization. They're an informal organization of members, primarily on Twitter, popped up after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, kind of like a digital legion of its own, fighting against the absurdity of Russian disinformation by calling out trolls, reporting bots and propaganda, and raising funds and support for Ukraine. But what makes them so successful is this use of humor and meme culture, which is so effective because it has the effect of cutting right through to the truth and really highlighting the absurdity of Russian claims. And I find this worth mentioning because it's a really powerful example of a civil society initiative filling gaps where the government, or tech couldn't possibly reach on their own. And I'd love to see a study to see what we can learn from their methods and successes. I'll also mention, the EU has had really strong initiatives to regulate disinformation, the Media Freedom Act, Digital Services Act, AI Act. I don't think these initiatives could be replicated in the US context, but I think that the US should pay close attention to the rollout of these initiatives and see if there are elements that can be borrowed. And lastly, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention just the absolutely important pivotal role of funding independent media and supporting press freedom abroad. The US government does a lot of this, whether that's through RFERL, Voice of America, USAID funding, or direct assistance, but high quality investigative journalism is one of our best weapons against disinformation. And a free media space is really a prerequisite to fighting disinformation. I mean, in places where there isn't press freedom, it's an uphill battle. You know, disinformation will flourish, and it makes it just that much harder to combat.
Thank you. I think civic publics have always depended on technology, and there were some very fortunate accidents when civic publics met with technology like the coffee house and the printing press in the 17th, 18th centuries that created political parties and democracy as we know it today. I think one of the worst accidents of the 21st century is when civic publics have met digital platforms as a technology. As we know today from organizational science, trying to understand platform as an organizational form, one of the fundamental features of platforms is deflected accountability. Trying to step away from accountability as far as possible and just be the algorithmic background to producers and consumers, creators and consumers meeting, and not participate in anything other than being interested in the scale, in more and more and more of traffic. This meeting with civic publics created something very toxic. And I think we need to undo this somehow. We need to do something about this. If you think of the coffee house as the background platform, if you want to say, of democracy and civic publics, it was all accountability. It was all visibility, face-to-face community, where you could exclude and bracket voices that were profoundly destructive and try to go for the rational, constructive discourse of trying to find what's the public good, what's the common good. I don't know how digital platforms could serve that purpose. It doesn't seem to be the case. And I don't have the analog of the coffee house today, but for sure, digital platforms are not it.
Yeah, thanks. So, yeah, Blanka told me at the beginning of or before the discussion that I should be the optimist in this panel. So I tried to live up to this role after we learned it from Joe that the things were already pretty bad in the past. So it's like not particularly bad at the present. So one promising result we had in the researches we had with my colleagues at ELTE University and at Artois University. We did an experimental research in cooperation with Beth's team, where we tested the impact of an intervention that based on two main principles. One is social bonds, invest in social bonds. Second is to empower the subject of disinformation. And what we did in particular is that we gave a description to the many hundreds of our research subjects with a general, how to say, strategy on how to identify fake news and disinformation, how to differentiate between real news and fake news. And then we asked them to write a letter, and some might find it a bit politically incorrect, but to their grandmas or their, because it was a research we did among youngsters. So, or another family member who is less experienced in digital, let's say, in the digital world and also in recognizing fake news than you are. So you have to be the teacher. You have to write a letter and explain him or her how to fight disinformation. And we found that it had an impact immediately as well in the ability of our participants to differentiate between real news and fake news. And also we measured it 1 month after, and it still had an impact. And everyone who deals with interventions know that it's a very rare example. And we have tested it only in Hungary, but we were quite empowered, encouraged by this result. We would like to replicate it in some other countries as well, but we assume that this building on good social bonds and empowering the people in a populist age. I mean, when everyone is fed up with eggheads like us teaching others that you shouldn't believe the fake news and we tell you what is true, what is fake, we should try to come out of this, I think, asymmetric role and empower the people to try to find against fake news. For example, this is what I think Lakmusz does, for example, with the articles.
Well, coming to this question, like what is true and what is fake, I would still, to close the discussion, I would like to reflect a bit on the quite provocative article of the panel, whether anybody has the right to say what is true, what is false, what is conspiracy theory, what is not conspiracy theory. I would love to hear your opinion about this. At the same time, I would also like to open the floor to the audience because, yeah, we have like 5 minutes left. So if you have some very brief questions, please.
Thank you very much. I will be brief. Just more than a question, I would like to put on the floor as well one possible mitigation strategy for these disinformation problems. And I like the way you put it. As Péter and Michael were discussing this morning, earlier today on this keynote lecture, it's true that, you know, democracy is an open society. And so conspiracy theories circulate naturally in an open society. It's even a good thing from a certain point of view. But it is also true that in the last 10, 15 years, we have witnessed a dramatic change in the technology of political communication, the emergence of social media. And this is correlated a lot with disinformation, fake news, and with also the emergence of populism and anti-establishment movement we were discussing today. I have a paper that I published last year for Springer Nature, in which actually we show, using household data from European countries and from Italy, that there is a strong correlation between exposure to politics online and development of anti-European, anti-EU movement. And in particular, it's not exposure in general to politics online, but exposure to social media, more than looking at New York Times or Le Figaro on the web page, which is pretty clear. Now, in my books, the problem here is not social media per se. The problem is that we have a monopoly in the social media market. Why? This is the case because clearly you have enormous network externalities, and whenever you have network externalities in economics, you have first mover advantage. So if you are Nathan Zuckerberg, you have a huge advantage in getting to that. I'm closing. So the question is, how to me, it's technical argument. So, but take 30 seconds more. So the question is, given that the problem is monopoly, there is a way to minimize the circulation of misinformation without having to limiting the freedom of speech. And actually, it turns out that there is a way, and there was a proposal that a couple of years ago, 2 economists from Chicago, Guy Rolnick and Luigi Zingales, advanced, and this is the idea of reassigning the property rights on the social contacts, on the graph of contacts, from the platform to the user. In the very same way, when you change your telephone, before the telephone number was property of the company, now it's property of the consumer. So whenever you change your contract, you bring with your
really
number.
Sorry, I would like to give the floor to others.
So we could
a question mark at the end.
No, there is not a question mark. We could do the same. We could do the same, having more competition of the market and eliminating this problem of monopoly, just having this social graph portability. That's it. That's no question mark.
Oh, okay. And any questions, maybe?
Could you repeat the question?
Can we get some more questions? Yep.
Yes, thank you. Daniel Lukács from the Finnish embassy, and I would like to draw on 2 things that I heard. One is that we are the monster in the room, and the other one is that you got to actually interview conspiracy theorists or people engaged in these groups. And one part of the question is the monster living in all of us, or the potential to become the monster, or is there potentially, and then this comes to the more of the profiling, is there a profile? My understanding is that this has been researched, but there is no clear-cut profile of who is more prone to conspiracies than others. So it exists roughly equally in all socioeconomic groups and left and right. Is this still the case? And, or are there socioeconomic factors that have been identified now more recently? So sort of an update to what I know.
Can we collect one more question and then we answer?
Hi, my name is Guilherme. It's a quick question. The title of the panel is Arbiters of the Truth, and I would like just to know what you think about what's the role of the judiciary, certainly not as an arbiter of the truth, but as an arbiter of democracy. I think of that because of the example of my country, Brazil. The courts there have played a very important role during the elections, during the pandemics, to fight disinformation. Just a quick example, when my friends here in Hungary, they ask me, how the situation in Brazil? Well, it's bad. Yesterday, the president said that COVID vaccine may cause you to get AIDS. And now, well, having lost the election, he's now being prosecuted for a crime against public health. It's a more extreme case, you have to use criminal law. But anyway, what is the role of the judiciary in fighting disinformation?
Can we start with Joe, maybe, about the monster in us?
I'll hit all those questions really quick. So for that one, yes, there's like 20 studies that have, well, probably 100 at this point, that say there's a very strong correlation between social media use and conspiracy theory beliefs. Right, but what do we conclude from it? Is it that they went to the internet and became conspiracy theorists, or they were conspiracy theorists and they went to the internet because that's where they could get what they want? And I would probably say it's a lot more the latter, but there's still an effect where they're going to reinforce what they already believe. The other question, is it right or left? That will depend a little bit by country and what the circumstances are, and even more by what particular conspiracy theory we're talking about. In general terms, in the US, a lot of people think, oh, it's the right. But, you know, and there will be scholars who will disagree with me about this, but having collected data on this for a decade, they're very much the same in terms of their general levels of it, even though they believe different things at different times, and sometimes for different reasons. And then, is there a monster in all of us? A little bit. Right? So what I will say is that there is a disposition to buy into conspiracy theories. Some people have it really high up here. Some people have it very low. So, you know, we have a holiday in the US called Thanksgiving, and I'll have a few uncles who are way up here and a few uncles who are way down here. And then after a few bottles of wine have gone down, I'll bring up my research, and then I'll just let things happen. And I don't know if I'm getting invited back this year, but we'll see. But those dispositions are there, and they're pretty stable over time. So it's just not the case that it's all random exposure that's driving beliefs. People are either receptive to it or not. And even for people who are very receptive, they're often very selective in what ones they're going to believe. And I'll just say this very quickly before I pass the mic. So even for people who don't trust big pharma or the medical establishment, right, because of vaccines or whatever medicines, when they break their arm, you know where they're going, right? They're going right to the hospital, and they're not going to say, no, I believe in natural arm healing. And they're not going to say, well, I don't trust big plaster. I don't want to cast on my arm, right? So people are very picky with what ones they'll buy into, even if they have a strong distrust of lots of institutions. So it's all very, very specific.
So I think some of my co-panelists are better suited to answer some of the questions from the audience. But I mean, to your question about who has the right to say what is true, what is false, you know, I think fortunately we, you know, everyone has a right to say or believe what they want in democratic societies. I mean, that's what separates us from Russia, China, other autocracies of the world. It's up to the individual to determine his or her own reality, even if that reality is based in falsehoods. But it's important to strike that balance for allowing for individual freedoms, but also thwarting disinformation campaigns and supporting fact-based content. And you know, I welcome all of the tools and advice, you know, said on this panel today. You know, and to answer your question too more directly, like, even though we're in kind of a bizarre post-truth kind of world at times, renowned experts, academics, institutions, journalists, fact checkers, like, those are the types of credible sources that still matter, and we need to keep investing in good journalism, independent media, media literacy, and so forth.
Okay, so I'm inviting Joe to my Thanksgiving. That's what I've learned from this panel. I want to very quickly touch on the profile of a conspiracy theorist. I love this question, and I often cite Joe's research in answering it, so I won't say half of what I typically say here, but there are these psychological traits that are correlated. There's been a bunch of really great research in the last decade by psychologists on this, and what we found is there is this baseline level of what is often called a conspiracy mentality, and you've actually got these sort of stable scales now where you can measure your conspiracy mentality level. So you all should go home and measure your level. But beyond these sort of baseline levels of conspiracism that we each have, what I found from doing these interviews was that there were often 3 preconditions that took people from sort of skeptical to down a rabbit hole where they themselves were consuming vast quantities of like really extreme beliefs and then becoming spreaders of disinformation themselves. And so those 3 preconditions are a little bit more related to the socioeconomic conditions of the moment. So those were isolation. So maybe they had lost their jobs and they no longer were surrounded by coworkers, they were sitting at home by themselves, or they'd gone through a divorce, right? So some sort of isolating incident, maybe COVID. Alienation, so the sense of feeling alienated from systems of power. They were left behind by the information economy. Maybe their classmates from high school were all making a lot more money than them, and they were working at the gas station. And lastly, mistrust in the system and in institutions. There's definitely an anti-establishment bent to a lot of people who believe in conspiracy theories, and Joe's talked about this and written about this in some of his studies. But the people I met with, they had very real grievances where they had gone to a doctor and been misdiagnosed, or they had tried to get some sort of social service from the government and it had failed them. And it was something small, but it broke their trust. Or they had a story from a friend. And so these 3 created a cocktail, this isolation, alienation, and mistrust, where they said, I can't trust what I'm reading and hearing from institutions anymore. I need to go trust this conspiracy theorist that I'm hearing online.
I think I would caution a bit against focusing too much light onto the individual conspiracy theorist as a root of the problem, and then zoom out to powerful organizations, platforms, governments is also part of the problem. Science as the tool, as the community who can first understand things, and we are now being blocked out from collecting data on social platforms. X has just closed down its access. You have to pay $50,000 a month for scientific access, and other platforms are following. So the doors are closing for science to understand this problem. And I think that's just as big of a problem than individual conspiracy theorists spreading things. And on the other hand, we have governments, like Péter talked about, the Hungarian government, with massive resources and kind of like a professional machinery producing false content and pushing that in our faces. And the platforms are kind of partners in this, because they made, Facebook made the most money out of the Hungarian government in Europe in those months when it was the elections. So I think we should be careful, not to just zoom on one kind of a problem and see the bigger problems of power. Péter.
2 brief points. One, your question, can we fight disinformation without limiting freedom of speech? I think the response is no. Theoretically, yes, because if pre-bunking and inoculation worked perfectly, I mean, people were so prepared for recognizing disinformation and also to counter arguments that they would be immune, there would be no need for any content moderation. But I just don't really believe it's possible, also because of that if you have very strong beliefs, you will be automatically be quite vulnerable to disinformation, because it's like wishful thinking and ideological thinking is a fertile ground. So I think that especially when it comes to disinformation that can cause human lives, like anti-vaccination, like genocidal disinformation around the Russian invasion, I think tech platforms should do more, and there are, I think, fruitful attempts already. So I don't think it's a mission impossible, but it means that you have to tag, filter some kind of disinformation, so some kind of censorship, I think, is necessary. And the other question on who is vulnerable to disinformation, our studies in Hungary show that even in an environment where there is clearly an asymmetry in conspiracy theorizing, when the governmental side spreads more conspiracy theories than the opposition side, on the level of conspiracy mentality, we have rather an even playing field with the opposition voters having at least as much conspiracy mentality as the governmental voters, or sometimes even higher, because they feel deprived of power, and this feeling of lack of control also fuels a lot of conspiracy beliefs.
I didn't want to cut off the organizer, but I think. Yeah, so we are out of time, and I'm really sorry that we are out of time. And thank you so much for this fascinating discussion. And sorry for those who didn't have their questions asked, but I would suggest to continue the discussion maybe outside as well. Thank you.